Hi everyone, welcome. Thanks so much for joining today. So this webinar is the Synergi Small Grants Fund webinar, and Akiko and I are going to be talking through Synergi and the grants program, and kind of more information around how to apply and all the sort of useful information that you'll need if you're interested. So my name's Elena, my pronouns are she, her, and I am the Communities and Grants Coordinator at the National Survivor User Network, or NSUN for short. And on this grants fund, I'll be working as a grants officer, so I'll be processing the applications as they come in. And I'll just pass on to you, Akiko, to introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, my name is Akiko. I use she, her pronouns, and I work as the Chief Exec of NSUN. Within this grants programme, which we've all been working on collectively, I'll also be sitting, I'll be one of the panellists on the decision-making panel at the end. Okay, over to you, Elena.
Okay, so just to, there we go, just give a quick overview of what we're going to cover today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Synergi and give a brief overview of what we're doing with the Small Grants Fund and the wider project as well. And then I'm going to talk through the eligibility criteria for applying. So that will include what we can fund and what we can't fund as well. We then want to walk you through how, as a team, we're going to be making decisions when we're processing the applications. And then we will go on to talk about the process if you are successful and what will happen then. And then we're going to walk you through how to apply and do the application form as well. And then we'll have some time at the end for a Q&A. So if you have any questions, there's the Q&A chat and you can pop them in there at the end, and we will try and cover as many as we can. And yeah, hopefully give you a good sense of what this fund is aiming to do and what we're looking to fund. So what is Synergi? Synergi is a programme of work focusing on the intersection of mental health and racial justice. This is the second phase of Synergi. So the first phase was more focused on research in this area, particularly with services, mental health services, and racial equality. And this second phase is more focused on work that's being done on a grassroots level. So Synergi is hosted by the National Survivor User Network, or NSUN, and we are a membership organisation and a network of grassroots community groups and people with lived experience of mental distress, ill health and trauma. And through Synergi, we're launching a small grants fund supporting Black people and people of colour with lived experience of mental ill health, distress, or trauma who are taking action on mental health and racial justice. All of Synergi's work, including the grants programmes, is funded solely by Linkley Chase Foundation, and we will not and have not accepted any funding under Prevent or from the Home Office, to really keep this work completely separate from those sorts of institutions. We really wanted to emphasise that. So why is Synergi needed? So racial injustice and state violence often cause and exacerbate marginalised communities' experiences of mental health, distress or trauma. And what's more, when accessing traditional mental health services, marginalised communities are more likely to be subjected to harm and less likely to have access to the necessary and dignifying mental health care that they need. And in contrast, we know as a membership organisation of grassroots community groups that mental health and emotional well-being of racialised communities are often supported by user-led approaches. So through this funding programme, we really want to support these user-led approaches and those who are campaigning for change. So a little bit more information on the Synergi Small Grants Fund. So we'll be rewarding grants of £2,000 to £3,000. We would have liked to have been able to offer greater flexibility regarding lower amounts, but because we have a small team, this would mean a lot of assessments and managing a higher number of grants, and we don't have the capacity to do that at this stage. The grants will be supporting groups led by Black people and people of colour with lived experience of mental ill health, distress or trauma to take action on mental health and racial justice. And then the next slide will go into a bit more detail about the importance of each of these elements and a bit more detail into some of the ways in which this has been done and what we would like to fund through this. We only have a short window for applications, so we'll be open for applications between the 4th of January and the 29th of January 2023. So we really want to provide as much information as we can during this event so that you're prepared to apply once we've opened. And for those who are successful, once you've been granted the funding, that will need to be spent within the next 12 months. Also, this will be running for 3 years. So we'll be doing another grants programme in 2024 and another in 2025 as well. So these are some examples of the kind of things we're hoping to fund. We've split these up into 2 different themes and tried to be quite expansive about what these different things could look like, as we know a lot of different communities are dealing with mental ill health, distress and trauma in a lot of different ways. So the first sort of theme that we have is collective care. So this might look like providing food and essentials parcels, writing to incarcerated community members, creating opportunities for people to come together and support each other using shared experiences, as in peer support groups, mutual aid, creative practices like dancing, singing, arts and crafts, or covering the costs of accessing therapy or other healing practices. Our other theme that we have that we're looking at in terms of what we'd like to fund is campaigning and change making. So this could include protests, could also be work to create change on a local or national level, sharing information and skills such as community organising, training, or creating resources for members of your community to better advocate for themselves. And then we have the eligibility criteria, which you can also find on the website, which will have the link to in a later slide. But you must meet all of the following criteria and won't be able to apply. If you don't, or if you do apply, then you will not be longlisted. So these are all really key. So your group must be led by and for Black people and people of colour. Your group must be led by and for people who have shared experiences or identities with those they are creating spaces for. And your group must benefit people or communities who live with mental ill health, trauma and distress. So when it comes to sort of the question around who's leading the group, it's really important to think about who makes the decisions about how your group is run. How do you ensure everyone has the opportunity to be involved in making decisions? We also are aware that some groups will have some white members or members without experience of mental ill health, and they still will be eligible provided those members are neither the main decision makers or the main people who benefit. In terms of groups, we're encouraging to apply. So we want this funding to reach those communities experiencing the most extreme forms of discrimination, marginalisation and injustice, including state violence. So this might include, for example, the hostile environment, anti-trans legislation or policies, or PREVENT. And we want this funding to help you build community and to resist challenge. We also want to provide some counter to the historic underfunding of this work. And so in this context, we are encouraging applications from groups led by and for people from Muslim communities, groups led by and for trans and non-binary communities, groups led by and for refugees and or people seeking asylum, and then also groups with a yearly project income of under 25,000. We're also interested in funding groups whose work engages with an abolitionist framework, which we're going to explain in the next slide, and also groups with non-traditional structures, including those that are unregistered, which we'll also go into a bit more in the next slide. And I'm going to pass on to Akiko to take over from here.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Just to say, everyone, I think there's a little bit of a problem with the chat. So if you pop your questions into the Q&A, they should be visible to us, but I'm sorry the chat isn't working. So as Elena has just explained, one of the types of groups that we are encouraging to apply are groups who are taking an abolitionist lens or talking about abolition in their work. But just as a kind of like caveat around this, we really appreciate that lots of groups and organizations and projects won't be using this kind of language, so this won't resonate with some of them. Some people will be doing this work but won't be using these words to talk about it, and we get it, and some people will be operating outside of this as well. So in terms of abolition, what we mean by abolition is the end of what gets called casteal systems, so systems within society that seek to punish individuals and communities, which in turn contributes to mental ill health or distress. So this could include systems like prisons or policing or national borders or prevent or surveillance. And for a lot of people, that would also include traditional mental health structures and systems as well. So Synergi's work, like all abolitionist work, is about building. It's about experimenting with and building alternatives to these systems so that communities and people can live freely and with dignity and experience the care and support that they need. The other thing to pick up on in terms of the other slide is what do we mean by non-traditional structures? So as you all know, if you've been kind of like looking for funding before, a lot of funding opportunities are usually only available to registered charities. And we know that a lot of work happens outside of those structures. So we are also open to funding unconstituted groups, so groups which might not have like a governing document or constitution around them. Constituted but unincorporated groups, so groups which might have a governing document but are otherwise not otherwise unincorporated. Groups that might be CICs, so community interest companies, companies limited by guarantee, or social enterprises. And maybe something to pick up on from the last slide as well is that when we say groups with a project income of like 25,000 or under, and that's a priority group, we may be able to fund groups with a larger project income than that. We're aware that sometimes groups sit within larger organizations. So we're not necessarily looking at the budget of the larger organization, but the budget of the group or the project. Okay, to move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So some examples of stuff we can fund, and this is a non-exhaustive list. So we've put some examples on here, but there'll be stuff that comes up that's outside of this. So things like the cost to deliver your work, your support and activities. So that could be staff costs or sessional costs. It could be rent for room hire, for bills, equipment, art supplies, volunteer or group member expenses. We'll also fund campaigning costs. We'll also fund organizational development, so training or development or coaching for people in the group, tech subscriptions with equipment like Zoom, for example, or anything to support your business planning. What we won't be able to fund with this particular grants program are organizations that pay profits to shareholders or members, groups that operate solely outside of England. So we recognize that a lot of activity is going to be online for like many groups. But NSUN is, and that's totally fine. And therefore, the catchment will be kind of like outside of England only, but it's about where the majority of the work takes place or where the group is based, and that is because NSUN is a registered charity, and in our constitution, in our governing documents, our work has to be, the majority of our work has to be focused on England. We can't, I'm afraid, accept applications from individuals, and we can't fund things that have already, where the money has already been spent, so retrospective costs. So what's the application process? So the fund opens, the grant program opens on the 4th of Jan. So the website is live already, so you can have a look at the eligibility criteria, and there's also some FAQs, some frequently asked questions in there. And the first thing to do is really to complete the application form when it goes live at the beginning of January. So we recommend that you apply online. But you can also download the application form and submit it via email. What some people may find useful is to download the application form. And for those, there's a few questions, 3 or 4, where we're asking kind of like for more detail about your work and what you want the funding for. And you might want to kind of like write those out in Word and then copy and paste them into the online application form. Most of the other questions are questions like, what are you called and what's your email address? So that should be a little bit more straightforward online. If you need support during this application process, you can drop us an email and someone will get in touch with you and support you with writing your application. Then we do some kind of like internal checks as the applications come in, and as Elena kind of like shared, we've got these kind of like 3 main kind of like criteria. Is your group led by and for Black people and people of colour? You know, and the other 2 as well. And so that's the first, those are the first 3 questions that we will be asking. And if we feel that there is a good fit at that point, we would like to find out more about your work, and we will arrange calls with you, like so a call of like 20 to 30 minutes to find out a bit more about what you do and the difference funding will make. And the reason we do this is because this is the 4th small grants program that we have run. We're really aware that if you are a larger organization with maybe like a fundraising team, you might have all sorts of resource in place to be able to write kind of like applications that look kind of amazing because you just have that kind of expertise kind of like in-house. And we're just aware that a lot of grassroots groups like just do not, you know, don't have the capacity to do that. And therefore we find that we get like much more we just get much more of a sense of the work from these phone calls. So if at that point we feel it's still a good fit, it will then be shortlisted, and then it goes to the decision-making panel. So that panel will meet at the beginning of March. The names, so every member of the panel so all the members of that decision-making panel will be Black people or people of colour with lived experience of mental ill health, distress or trauma. And those names and profiles will be up on the website when all those names are confirmed at the beginning of January. So you kind of get a sense of like who's making the decisions here. We are hoping to make all these decisions and communicate them to you by the 10th of March. And if you've been successful, at that point, you'll be sent a grant offer letter outlining the terms and conditions of the grant. I think there's another slide where I talk about that in more detail. If you are not successful at that particular stage, you will be informed, but there will also be the opportunity for us to give you some feedback on your application if you would like it. So how are we going to make decisions about this? So this is something we spent a lot of time thinking about. So some of the questions we'll be asking ourselves will be, is the group led by the people and communities it is working alongside? Does it strongly benefit Black people and people of colour who live with mental ill health, trauma and distress? Does it match any of the priority groups we encourage to apply that Elena talked about earlier? And then how significant and achievable is the impact of the proposal? Is there anyone else funding this work? Does it challenge us and open wider opportunities for learning? And within those questions, really like it's the first 3, which I think will be the priority questions for us. So as I said, the grant making panel will meet in early March. You know, you'll see the profiles online when those names are confirmed. All members of the panel will be Black people and people of colour with relevant lived experience. And at the stage before that, we'll have grant officers, 4 grant officers shortlisting applications for the panel. And those are the people you will be speaking to if we arrange a call with you. So yeah, if you are successful, it should be a relatively straightforward process where you sign the grant offer letter. Just to flag at this point as well that if you have a bank account as an organisation or a group, we would pay the grant into that. But we are also open to, and have before funded groups or collectors who do not have bank accounts, and we would have some suggestions about how to do that and talk it through with you. And then the idea is that we would contact you at the midpoint of the grant to see how's it going. You know, are you spending the money in the way that you intended to? Have there been any changes? Because we're really aware that stuff can change. And we would also arrange an end of the grant phone call with you. And the restriction around it is that we would expect all funding to be spent within 12 months. So yes, so you can, I mean, I think most of you have probably found out about this via the website anyway, or possibly via the NSUN bulletin or Twitter. But the website is now live, synergyproject.org.uk, but you can't apply yet because the application form will only kind of go live on the 4th of Jan. But you will be able to download the form as a Word document as well if you would like to. And that email address there, synergy.grants@nsun.org.uk is where you would send that to, but also that's the email address to contact if you have any further questions around the grant. If you need any help completing the form, if, for example, you would like to talk to us about translation or interpretation, contact synergy.grants@nsun.org.uk or give us a ring at 0207 820 8982 and we will try to support you. Okay, and now it's time for questions, and I'm going to quickly look at the Q&A to see that. Okay, so, and just kind of like flagging that there will be questions we might not be able to answer, which is partly why we set up this this webinar, because we're just aware that there are things that we need to work out. So if there are questions we're not able to answer, what we will do is ask for your contact details so we can kind of contact you directly, and also hope to answer these questions for everyone and put them in the FAQ. So the question, I've got a question here. How many organizations are you looking to find out? So that question at the end, how many organizations are you looking to find out around the grant budget? Would you, I'm not quite sure I've quite understood that. Would you mind putting that looking to fund out of your grant budget? Elena, do you have the number to hand? It's 50.
Yes. Yeah, we said 40 to 50.
50.
I think is the, yeah. I'll just double check to be 100% sure because I do have it somewhere here.
I think that's right. It's 40 to 50.
Yeah. 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 So.
So we've got a question from someone who's a sole trader working in mental health. Can they be considered for the grant? Can I get back to you on that? I think as things stand, potentially not, is my not very considered answer at the moment. But are you okay to either drop us an email or put your email in the Q&A if that feels okay, and we will get back to you on that and also clarify that answer in the FAQs, because that's a really, really important question. Thank you. Okay, if the CIC, I thought we might get this, the CIC is set up in England and operates there, but the project only works in Scotland. Is that an issue? It might be. I think it might be. And again, what I would like to do is get back to you on that, if that's okay. Are there any, so this is not the most interactive format, so it's quite hard to kind of work out if there are, oh, I've got some more questions at the bottom, sorry, they've just come up. Someone is saying thank you, and they appreciate there's been considerations for organisations that don't have a fundraising team. It can be really daunting as a small team trying to complete lengthy application forms, but this process seems straightforward. Thank you. I hope it is. You know, it's the fourth time we've run something like this, and we're really, really open to feedback. So there'll be things that we've got wrong with this, and we'd actually like to hear from people about it kind of like after the process to see if we can kind of get it right. But yeah, I mean, having kind of been on the other side of like this process and applying for funding, just trying to make it as simple and straightforward as possible for people feels really important. Does this funding only apply to England only? So the majority of the activities really need to be taking place in England, but we appreciate that because activities, if you're doing something online, you'll be catching people kind of in the other nations, but also overseas, and that's totally fine. But it's something about like where the majority of the activities take place. Do you fund participatory action research projects where all the other criteria have been met? I think so. What do you think, Elena? That's a lovely question.
Yeah, I definitely think that, because again, as I said before, I think that this kind of work shows up in a lot of different ways. And I think if it meets the criteria, and is obviously for the benefit of that community, then I can't see that being a problem. So I would say yes.
Yeah.
There was also another question earlier, which was, will an organisation be able to apply all 3 years if they are successful in the first year, which I thought was a good thing to raise. I don't think we've kind of explicitly discussed that yet because it's our first round of the fund. But it may potentially make you maybe less likely in the following years if you've been funded before. I'm not sure if you have a straight answer to that one, Akiko.
We don't as yet, I'm afraid. So we will have a better sense of this, in the early part of next year. So I'm not sure is the answer, because I think there's something about like sustainability and being able to kind of like, fund groups kind of like over a number of years that feels really important. And there's also that thing about how do you balance that out with there's limited amount of money, and how do you bring new people groups in it as well. And I think that's a conversation we're going to have internally around that. So yeah, kind of bear with us on that. Got a question here about if you're an individual planning to run a group therapy for people of color, can you apply? I think if you're applying as an individual, you can't. So it would have to be like the group that applies, if that makes sense. But the group doesn't have to be constituted in any way, kind of like as we said before, but the application has to come from the group, not the individual. How small can the group or organization be? Like really small. Really small. I mean, we are interested, like, so one of the questions will be like, what is the community you're serving? So it's not about like how many people are in the groups, because we like totally recognize that sometimes you're doing stuff with like 5 or 10 people, and that has value. So we won't necessarily be making decisions on that. So yeah, small is fine, but yeah, there'll be kind of like an opportunity for you to talk about kind of like the size and kind of like what you do in the application form. What is the grant amount? So £2,000 to £3,000, so kind of like anything in between that. Would you look to support a BAME-focused peer-led recovery addiction organisation as this impacts mental health? The reason I ask is because there's a procured council-funded service, but we believe they do not reach these communities and take into account cultural or racial trauma. Yeah, so that is something that would be, if it meets the criteria in terms of like being, user-led, etc., then that in principle is something that we would, that we would look at. And maybe the thing to kind of make really, really clear here is that, we are not looking to fund groups or projects or organizations that are mental health first. So like, we totally appreciate that people like come at this in different ways, and will not necessarily kind of like use the same language around talking about mental health. And, so for example, if you're kind of like working in, so what is this kind of like recovery addiction services, you might use different language around this, but for us, that kind of falls under the broad remit. So that is a yes. And I have kind of like sped through these questions. Have I missed anything, Elena? Are there any live questions that you can see?
I don't think so. Oh, there's another one that's just come in now. What's your position on seeking other funding if the amount is not sufficient? I mean, I think as long as we know what the funding is covering that we're granting, and we've seen the budget and we know where it's going, what it's going towards. If you're using other sources of funding to support what you're doing, that is not a problem. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add, Akiko, but that's absolutely fine in my mind. So
any other questions from anyone? Just to flag that, so this is obviously being recorded. So other people can view it as well, but they won't see the Q&A or the chat, just kind of like us talking and answering these questions. But there is that email address where you can contact us if you've got kind of more specific questions now or when the fund opens, and we want to make this as kind of accessible as possible. And there were a couple of questions there where I said we'd get back to people, and we will do that as well and provide more clarity on our website. I think that is it. Yeah, Elena, do you reckon? Cool.
I think so, yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much for, oh, hang on, I'm just going to check again. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really, really excited about launching this. It's been such a pleasure to kind of work on, and we're so excited to kind of like to see who applies, and yeah, to kind of like start building relationships with you when you apply. So yeah, really, really excited about this. So thank you for coming along, and we really hope you apply. And yep, in the meantime, have a lovely break. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone.